The Bloodstone's origin. The forest had always been ancient. It was as if the trees themselves held the memory of a time before time, a time when the world was simpler, darker, and far more dangerous. Magic was wild then, unrefined, alive in every stone, every breath of wind, every drop of blood spilled. The world had once belonged to the old gods, who roamed freely and whose power bled into everything they touched. But there was one thing even the gods feared: the creation of the Bloodstone. It wasn't forged by human hands, nor was it born of the earth or the stars. The Bloodstone was a thing of pure malice, conceived in the very heart of a dying god's curse. When the gods turned against each other in their great wars, the Bloodstone was created as a weapon, a way to bind the gods' blood into a single vessel, so that their immortality and power could be corrupted, harnessed, and turned against them. The origin of the curse was not written in history. It was whispered in shadows, found in the ruins of forgotten temples, where the bones of the gods lay scattered. But it wasn't just the gods who feared the Bloodstone. The ancient witches, those first wielders of magic, had felt its power long before humanity had learned to summon fire from the earth or pull the winds with a chant. It was the Thornwell family, the ancestors of Liliana's line, who had first come into contact with the stone. The Bloodstone's magic was insidious, binding the witches who dared touch it with blood and shadow. The first of them, Celine Thornwell, had sought the stone not for power, but to save her people. The witches had been a small, fragile group in those early days, hunted by humans who feared their magic. The humans had believed the witches were demons, creatures born of hell to steal the souls of men. Celine had thought she could use the stone to protect her coven. She believed the magic within it could be harnessed, shaped into a force that could shield her people from the human scourge. But the Bloodstone had a different plan. It had no intention of protection, only destruction. Celine had not known that the stone was cursed, that it was a vessel for the blood of gods, a blood that could never be tamed. When Celine took the Bloodstone into her hands, it bonded with her on a molecular level, twisting her blood, her magic, and her very soul. She had been transformed, becoming something not quite human, not quite witch, but something far darker. Her coven, too, was marked by the stone's power, each of them corrupted by its influence. They had become immortal, but not in the way they had hoped. They were bound to the stone, locked in an endless cycle of life and death, constantly dying and resurrecting, each time their bloodline growing more twisted, more broken. But the curse didn't just affect the witches. As the stone's influence spread, so too did its reach. It called out to a creature of the night, something that had once been a myth to the witches, a shadow of the forest, a predator who thrived in darkness. Vampires. The Bloodstone called to them as well, weaving a bond between witch and vampire that had never existed before. The first vampire to come into contact with the stone was a man named Dante, a name that would echo down through the centuries, carried by the bloodline of the vampires who followed him. Dante had been a soldier in a war that spanned centuries, and like many before him, he had long searched for immortality. He had heard the whispers of the Bloodstone, rumors of a relic that could grant him eternal life, power that would never fade, a life that would never end. But when he touched the stone, the curse claimed him as it had claimed the witches. He was made immortal, yes, but in a way he never expected. Vampires who touched the Bloodstone didn't just become ageless. They became something darker, something bound to the stone's malignant power. They became creatures of hunger, driven by a thirst not just for blood, but for the very essence of life itself. The bond between the witches and vampires had been forged in the fire of the Bloodstone, but it had been twisted by its hunger. The Witches' Pact. What the witches and vampires both realized too late was that they were no longer simply enemies or strangers. They were linked, bound by a curse that stretched across generations. The Bloodstone was a source of power, but it was also a prison. And neither the witches nor the vampires could escape it. But there was something even darker that had come from the stone's creation. The curse did not merely bind them to the stone, it bound them to each other. Each generation of witches and vampires would be drawn together, in an unspoken truce of blood and magic. Though their powers were different, though their fates were twisted in different ways, they were bound inextricably to one another. The curse was a strange and bitter one. The witches needed the vampires to remain alive, especially in times of war, when the witches' power was weakest. The vampires, in turn, craved the witches' magic, which could keep their immortality intact, stave off the hunger that gnawed at their existence. But there were darker forces at play. Each time a witch and vampire were drawn together by the Bloodstone, the curse grew stronger, feeding on the lives they sacrificed, the blood they spilled. The more they resisted the bond, the stronger the pull became. Over time, the two factions, once bitter enemies, had to learn to coexist, knowing that the only way to break free from the curse was to destroy the Bloodstone itself. But how could they destroy it, when their very existence was intertwined with it? The silent mission. The reason the High Priest sent Dante to retrieve the Bloodstone, it is said that if a witch and a vampire reclaims the Bloodstone at the same time, one of them will be sucked into a vortex from where there is no return. The vampire's citadel lay buried beneath layers of stone, its ancient halls echoing with the weight of centuries. The Council of Elders, composed of the most ancient and powerful vampires, convened in secret to discuss a matter of grave importance, the Bloodstone. But the decision was not one of fate, it was one of strategy. It had been centuries since the Bloodstone had been lost, its location hidden by an intricate web of magic and forgotten by all but the most ancient of beings. But now, something had begun to stir. A disturbance rippled through the magical world. The realms between mortals and immortals were growing thin, and the Bloodstone, the key to holding the fabric of reality together, was waking. The Council knew that they had to retrieve it before its power could spiral out of control. But there was one problem. The Bloodstone could not be reclaimed by a single force, not by a single entity. According to ancient lore, only when both a witch and a vampire joined forces to claim the stone would its full power be unlocked. But there was a catch. The legends spoke of a vortex, a swirling tear in the very fabric of reality that would open up once the stone was touched by both a witch and a vampire at the same time. And when that happened, one of them would be claimed by the vortex, sucked into an eternal prison from which there was no return. The vortex did not discriminate, it took one or the other, a punishment for those who dared to seek the stone's power. This was a risk the Council could not afford to take. The Bloodstone was too dangerous, and both witches and vampires were too precious. So, when the time came to act, the High Vampire Priest made a calculated decision. He sent Dante. The High Vampire Priest's calculations. The High Vampire Priest, Victor, had known the ancient prophecies. He knew the risk, but he also understood that this mission could be used to his advantage. Victor's mind, ancient and sharp, saw an opportunity in the curse of the Bloodstone, an opportunity that few others in the vampire court could comprehend. Victor's position as the High Priest of the vampires had come at great cost. He was powerful, yes, but his power was bound by ancient rituals and bloodlines. He had been living in the shadow of the Bloodstone's curse for centuries, bound to its legacy and its promise of eternal life. But the Bloodstone's true power wasn't just in immortality, it was in control. Control over the very fabric of magic, control over the mortal realm, and control over life and death itself. And yet, Victor feared what would happen if both a witch and a vampire successfully claimed the stone. The vortex was a gamble. And while he was too important to risk, he wasn't blind. He knew that a powerful wildcard might have a better chance of navigating this dangerous path. That wildcard was Dante Arkham. Dante, the chosen one. Dante was no stranger to manipulation. He had long suspected that his bloodline, though young and seemingly unremarkable in the eyes of the older vampires, had a connection to the Bloodstone. But he had no idea just how deep that connection ran, or how the High Priest had planned to use him. When the Council convened, Victor had chosen Dante not for his strength, nor for his loyalty to the vampire court, but for something far more strategic. Dante was not yet fully consumed by the curse of the Bloodstone, not yet fully bound to the ancient rituals of the vampire elite. In many ways he was still free. Free of the chains that had tied the older vampires to their past. Free from the obligations that governed their every move. Dante had been sent to retrieve the Bloodstone not just because he was expendable, but because he was uncorrupted by its magic, making him an ideal candidate to deal with the powerful forces that awaited him. The high priest knew that he would be able to control Dante in ways he couldn't control the other, more established vampires. And while Dante was on his journey, Victor would continue to manipulate the situation from behind the scenes, ensuring that the risk of the vortex consumed only one of them. But Victor had underestimated something: Dante's determination, his growing awareness of the manipulation, and his innate connection to the stone. As Dante embarked on his journey to reclaim the Bloodstone, he would discover not only the true extent of his bloodline's connection to the artifact, but the price that Victor had placed on him. A price that went beyond mere survival. The journey begins. When Dante was summoned before the council, he hadn't known the full extent of his mission. He had simply been told that the Bloodstone needed to be reclaimed, that its power could not be left unchecked, and that he was the one chosen to retrieve it. The high priest Victor had looked at him coldly, his eyes betraying nothing. "You are the one who will bring the stone to us, Dante," Victor had said. "But remember this, the stone will be claimed, one way or another. Either by you or by the witch you encounter along the way. And when you touch it together, one of you will be taken by the vortex. There is no escape. But you are expendable. The council will not mourn your loss." Dante had stared at the priest, sensing the unspoken agenda in Victor's words. There was something more here, something hidden beneath the surface. As the journey unfolded, Dante learned the terrible truth. He was meant to fail. The high vampire priest had sent him in hopes that, if the stone was reclaimed with a witch, someone like Liliana, the vortex would consume her. She, being the last of the Thornwell bloodline, was seen as a threat to the vampires. A powerful witch could tip the balance of power between their two factions, especially if the Bloodstone chose her over a vampire. Dante had become nothing more than a pawn in Victor's larger game, sent on a mission that would ensure the destruction of a witch, Liliana, the last hope for her bloodline. But Victor had made one critical error. He hadn't counted on Dante's growing defiance.